Thanks, Doug. Okay, moving on. The next presentation, I'll be giving this on behalf of my colleagues at the U.S. Agency for International Development on how they're institutionalizing adaptive management to improve their biodiversity and forestry programming. So I'll cover, like the other presenters have done so far, how this donor is approaching that, institutionalizing adaptive management, what kind of support and systems they've put into place to do that, and what have been their challenges and achievements. And I'm presenting this on behalf of my USAID colleagues. Many of them couldn't join. They have a big meeting in the Philippines this week. So I've been working with many of them over the last 5 years as the Asia regional lead for our support for them in doing this. So they've helped me put together this presentation to share with you. So a little bit about this particular donor. The USAID leads the U.S. government's efforts in international development, and they have many sectors, but they have a particular sector in the environment and global climate change topic. And this particular sector of USAID invests about $250 million a year in biodiversity projects in over 50 countries around the world. So a very large donor having a big impact on biodiversity. They've put a number of systems in place to try to improve adaptive management within especially this sector, and hopefully moving into the rest of the organization. So one of the first steps they did was they established the Bureau of Policy Planning and Learning in 2011, based in Washington, D.C., but with offices in the field offices around the world. And they, in 2011, introduced this adaptive management cycle, their own version of it, which they call the program cycle. And it's intended to be similar to the open standards, a cyclical process focusing on gathering evidence, systematic learning about what's working, what's not working in their projects around the world. And their priority is to try to make this work by integrating their policies and their practice in the field. So another step that they take to operationalize this, in 2011, they modified their evaluation policy, so that it isn't just, used to be very focused on outputs, numbers of trainings done, people trained, to emphasize learning and more systematically gathering evidence to generate knowledge about what's working, what's not. So now that's a very big part of their evaluation policy. Another step they took in 2014 was they put in place a biodiversity policy. And this explicitly said for all biodiversity funding that they give out, there must be an explicit biodiversity goal, there must be an analysis of drivers and threats, and the projects must monitor indicators associated with a stated theory of change, which sounds very familiar to us that are using the open standards. In 2017, their major planning document for the entire agency, called an ADS 201, requires the use of logic models throughout the agency beyond the biodiversity sector. And in that document, it identifies and has an image like this, that a results chain is a type of logic model that can be used to depict a theory of change. So we're starting to see more USAID projects actually using results chains. So these are the innovations and the approach in the agency. So how have they actually been operationalizing it? I'll talk about that next. So one of the first steps they took was to contract a project that's called Measuring Impact, or I'll use the acronym MI for short. And this is a 5-year project, but it's actually in its 6th year now, running since 2013, where they contracted several organizations to help them train and build the capacity of people in the field, of their own staff, plus the projects that they are contracting to actually operationalize this adaptive management. And the groups that are involved in that are Environmental Incentives, Our Organization, Foundations of Success, and ICF. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the agency has asked us to operationalize this. So over the last 6 years, they've had us working in all of these field offices around the world with 36 of their projects to actually implement these policies. I'm going to speak specifically about the work in Asia, where I've been involved with them. These are the countries where they're active in Asia. These are high biodiversity countries. And in these countries, we'll talk about a few of the ways that they're operationalizing these policies through project design, startup, and regular adaptive management reviews. And I know some of you in the room here have even been involved in some of this. So one of the steps they're taking is they're asking those projects to go through the field offices, their own staff, to use conceptual models to design their USAID projects that are focused on biodiversity. And also to use those to lay out what the conservation problem is, and to also identify what were possible strategies they'd want their grantees to use when they contract them to address this problem. And you can see here a picture of a team in Indonesia that's designing a large marine project using conceptual models. They're using, to some degree, Marathi as well. And they've also asked us to create guidance for them. Caroline Stem, who's here, has been working a lot on that. And that a lot is modeled after open standards approaches that we're all familiar with. Oops, sorry for that. That'll go away. Secondly, after a project is contracted and they have the grantees or the implementing partners on board, they now encourage all those projects to go through a startup where they'd actually look through the situation model that was developed by the USAID staff. The contractors would then develop results chains for the final strategies. They attach actions and monitoring elements to those results chains, just as we're familiar with the open standards. And that all then goes into the project's work plan and their monitoring and evaluation and learning plan. Here again is that team in Indonesia working on their results chains. And again, there's guidance that the agency has asked us to develop to guide that process. And the third step they're taking with projects in the field is they're encouraging all these projects after every year to go through an adaptive management review, where they'd actually look at their actions. Are they implementing them or not? Are they making progress towards their targets or their objectives and goals as we would know them? And what needs to change, what needs to be adapted? And that then is used to update their work plan for the next year for that project and their monitoring and evaluation plan. And here's a team in the Philippines actually using a stoplight diagram approach to assess what was working, what was not. And again, they've had us create guidance for their teams on how to do that. And the things with asterisks in my presentation I've shared on the resource sites. You can see example agendas, you can see an example of the policy documents, you can see links to the guidance documents that have all been developed for this particular donor. And those may be relevant even to your projects. So this is that I put in the link for the project resource site. A lot of other resources have been created to guide this donor and their grantees to actually operationalize the open standards process. And they're not saying it is necessarily exactly the open standards, but it's a modification. It's definitely an adaptive management approach. This even includes common results chains like we would see on Marathi Share, where you would have generic results chains for some of their most common strategies, so that if they are implementing similar strategies among multiple projects, multiple field offices, they could use a common results chain to compare what's working, what's not. So finishing this off, challenges and achievements. Some of the biggest challenges that they've had to address and are addressing is modifying their timelines. These projects typically came out very quickly and teams were expected to mobilize within 60 days. And some of you are probably familiar with that. And that didn't really allow the field office in USAID the time to design the project nor the implementing partner the time to make the results change and think through, look at the evidence. So they've started to modify their timelines to address that. They have typically been an agency really focused on output indicators. And now their teams are moving into how to incorporate outcome indicators. Are results happening? How would they measure that? These are contracts typically. And so an implementing partner or grantee signs a contract with the agency. But when you go through an adaptive management review, as we know, you may find that you need to make changes. Sometimes that has been difficult where you have very strict contracts. So their contracting offices have started to be more flexible. How do we incorporate that? And then their project evaluations have oftentimes looked again at outputs. And now there's been a lot of involvement in building the capacity of evaluators at USAID to look at learning and outcomes, not only outputs. So they've made a lot of achievements. This is a huge agency. It takes a while to turn a big ship. And some of the major steps are that they have reformed their planning policy. We see that they have mandated now theories of change for all levels of programming across the agency, which is huge. They are using situation models and results chains for their planning, their monitoring and evaluation. So that's, and they have really codified all of this guidance for their teams, which is really exciting. We are seeing that they're modifying their business practices, their contracting offices, their program and evaluation offices are bending or becoming more flexible in trying to implement adaptive management, instill it in the agency. So this has been exciting results. Okay, this is the last slide. I just want to show you there are folks in Washington who are behind this that couldn't be here today. Their names are all here for more information. There's a lot of this material up on the Google site that we'll share with you, and I can also address any questions when we come to the panel discussion. So that's it, thanks. So